afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this April online seminar of the CPR Standing Group on the EU. I'm very pleased to welcome our speakers today and the discussants for a seminar on gender equality in the candidate selection and leadership allocation practices within the European Parliament. This is a presentation based on the forthcoming book by Yale and Andrea. So I will first introduce our two speakers and our discussant, and then we'll go on to the presentation. So William Daniel is Associate Professor in Comparative Politics in the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Nottingham. Andrea Aldrich is lecturer in the Department of Political Science at Yale University, where she works on political representation, gender, and comparative political institutions. And then after their presentation, we'll have the pleasure to have comments from Johanna Kantola, who is Professor of European Societies and their Politics in the Center for European Studies at the University of Helsinki. And after Johanna, we'll have questions and comments from all of you. Since we are a small group, I think we can have a very informal and open discussion. So Will and Andrea, the floor is yours for about 40 minutes.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to present this today. We have sort of just gotten the whole project together as one draft, and we had a workshop last week about it. So this comes at perfect timing to get some feedback from a little bit of a different audience. So Will and I are working on a project. It's a book project called Career Disruptors, Quotas, Gender Quotas as Game Changers for the Recruitment, Selection, and Performance of Elected Politicians. Today we'll present a little bit of an overview of what we have learned so far, and then focus in on one of the specific chapters. So just to start, we'll give you an overview of what the project is. So we started on this thinking about how do quotas disrupt the career trajectories of men and women. And we use this word disrupt in a positive way, sort of as like shaking up the system and shaking up sort of the norms that have been in place for a very long time. Not so much in this is a bad thing for careers, but seeing as how it's sort of reorganizing the way that political careers work for men and women. And in the larger project, we explore how the use of quotas change the behavior of politicians and political parties with respect to career progression. So candidate selection, election to institutions, leadership in institutions, and movement between institutions. We hope that the project will contribute to this quota literature that's largely based on sort of how quotas affect the composition of legislatures. And we'll look a little bit deeper into how quotas can actually change the nature of multi-level careers. And finally, we, in the project, assess how quotas affect the choices made by parties and individuals with all of these things with respect to becoming candidates, being elected, gaining office, having leadership positions, and then again, moving across different institutions. We view the contributions of our project to be sort of a larger view of how country and party rules sort of work together with quotas to give us an in-depth understanding of how quotas have disrupted the career paths of men and women politicians. We want to explain how quotas affect career trajectories. And we do this, we think, in a bit of a unique way by looking at all phases of a legislator's political life, from recruitment and selection for office to internal promotion and advancement. And then we look a little bit at progressive ambition and future external office. We hope to move the quota literature sort of beyond access and explore what happens when political systems open to women. And we're doing this. We know there's lots of great work that do this with respect to policy and representation, but we're going to look at it more at an individual and party level about what it does for careers. And then part of this is that we have spent lots of time putting together this large cross-national data set on the careers of men and women legislators in the European Parliament over time. So we have a lot of information about each member of the European Parliament from 1979 to 2019, and some information about what they're doing before, during, and after their term. What this ends up being is that we have actually tracked national parties over time. We've identified about 400, and I think it's 436 now, unique national parties that have served in the European Parliament. And in most of the analysis, we narrow this down to about 200 political parties that have served over all 9 waves of the parliament. And we think that this is a sort of value added of the project, because that was actually a really hard and arduous process to follow these parties over time. But then we also know that the European Parliament presents this super unique opportunity to capture quota effects, where some of the legislators are exposed to quotas and some are not. This is because, of course, there are different countries with different national level quotas coming into the European Parliament, but it's also unique in the way that there are lots of ideologically similar parties coming into the institution that may or may not have quotas. So unlike a national legislature where your social democrats may have a quota, in the European Parliament, some social democrats have a quota, but some do not. And we think that's sort of a unique feature of this project and of this data. So we're going to give you a little bit of a glimpse into our theoretical approach and the way that we think quotas are affecting career trajectories. So we started out thinking about quotas as first rearranging the way that men and women both enter office and the way that they move through office. And we theorized this as first quotas used as being a shock to the opportunity structures that exist for men and women. So when quotas come into play, we argue that they are going to make entry points in political careers more similar for men and women. So where it had previously been difficult, say, for women to get a good spot on a list for an election, a quota will help them achieve that higher spot on the list in a way that wasn't available before. And what this means is that party delegations will become more diverse over time, and men's and women's careers, starting points in their careers will become similar. As quotas, after they come into effect, we also then think that there is a change that quotas make to careers, that they actually change the path that careers will take over time. And we conceptualize this as a slope shift in the career trajectories of men and women within parties and institutions, so that women can move through their careers faster and that the speed at which they move through their careers becomes more similar to men's. In doing so, and in some of the empirical chapters that I'll briefly present today, we actually identify who are the winners and kind of the losers from the use of quotas. And we find that overall quotas have a positive effect on women, on high quality men, on party delegations and institutions. And really those that are affected negatively by quotas are sort of low quality men, or men with lower qualifications that then do not have the same, or have to compete for office with high quality women. So this picture that we have on this slide, this is the kind of institutional impact we see of gender quotas. So we know that over time, the percentage of women and men in higher office has been becoming more and more similar without quotas. Like, this is just an artifact of sort of the opening up of political systems as a whole. But we expect the use of a quota in an institution to sort of make like a discontinuous jump in the number of men and women. But because if you have more women entering an institution, and the number of people in the institution does not change, it necessitates a reduction in the number of men. And so we expect then this jump to happen to both men and women, and for them to move closer over time. These pictures are ones that we have in our theoretical chapter that I'll try to explain just briefly here, but this is the effect that we think quotas will have on individuals. So we have in figure A, this is before quota, and figure B, this is after quotas. So we start our theoretical chapter by conceptualizing this relationship between the ambition of men and women and how it relates to like the time that they have spent in their career. And so you see the x-axis is career time and the y is realized ambition. And we think for women, we make an argument that really, and we have some empirical evidence to back this up, that the women who enter into politics are really highly qualified women across the board. It's definitely a little bit more difficult, especially sort of in the earlier stages in our data, for women to have access to office at all. And so the low qualified women just really don't show up in our data. But we think that what we see for men's careers is really the aggregation of men that are of high quality and men that are of low quality. So your average man is sort of the kind of like the mean male legislator. And before quotas, men both enter office earlier in their careers and at higher points. So it's easier for them to, say, start their legislative career at a national legislature than a local legislature, whereas a woman might have to start in local office and spend lots of time there. And so this is why there is an intercept difference between men and women. But then we also know that the speed at which men and women move through their careers is different. And so here you can see the average man has a steeper slope than the average woman. They're able to move from levels of office and from position to position a little bit faster than women. So our argument in the way that quotas sort of rearrange this is that they can do two things. They can both bring women in at a higher position when they start their legislative careers. So this is what you see where this dotted purple line has an intercept that's higher than the solid purple line. We also think that they change the speed at which women move through their careers. So now the slope of the dotted purple line is similar to the slope of the high achieving men. And what happens is that low achieving men experience the reverse of this. So they then have to start lower in their careers because they are experiencing more competition, and that the slope of their line is going to flatten a little bit because they are no longer going to be able to sort of just like coast by moving through their careers now that we have highly qualified women to replace them. So that is sort of the theory in a nutshell. The best I can do in a few minutes, and that's the starting point of where we start this. Of course, we have moving parts in this that are related to both individuals, institutions, and to parties. And today we're going to talk mostly about institutions and parties in the European Parliament. But what we have learned so far from this work is that first, quotas work. I mean, this is a really relatively well-known artifact of quotas is when they work and they are enforceable and they are effective, they will increase descriptive representation. And of course, we find this is true in the European Parliament. We also are able to show in this project that quotas are equalizing in some of the descriptive characteristics of men and women when they're used in European elections. So we have a paper right now that is hopefully about to come out, where we show that in terms of education, these quotas have an effect on sort of raising the level of education for all MEPs in the European Parliament, and that they do this through this exact sort of replacement effect of low quality men for high quality men. But we also have an older piece in Politics and Gender where we show in the 2014 Parliament that party delegations that used quotas generally had men and women that were far more similar in terms of their previous profession, their age, and their previous government's experience than parties that did not use quotas. We also show that quotas are equalizing career paths across levels in the European Parliament and national parliaments, so that nationally ambitious women, or those that want to move to the national parliament after the European Parliament, are able to do so at similar rates to men when quotas are used. And in non-quota parties, women make this move at a substantially slower rate than all three of these groups, than both non-quota men, than quota women, and quota men. And I can show you a couple of our main findings here. I'll just run through these briefly, but in one chapter we show that when there is a quota, and we measure quotas by whether it's one that is enforced by national legislation or it is a quota that a party implements themselves. We call that any level of quota, that it increases the level of education within the level of educated women within a parliamentary delegation. And so when quotas are in use, there are more women in the delegation, and these women are highly educated, both with postgraduate and undergraduate degrees. And we're able to show and isolate in our model the mechanism for which this happens. And it happens mostly by a replacement mechanism where women just become a larger share of the delegation. And we show that these women are not better educated than women that were in delegations before them. We show that the women were always highly educated, and now there are just more of them. But the reason that the overall quality of the delegation goes up is that quotas actually bring in men that are more highly educated, and the share of educated men among men increases when quotas are in use. So that's an interesting, one of the interesting chapters that we have in the book. And then the other one, we can show this figure right here. This is where we talk about movement from the European Parliament to the national parliament. So we measure it two ways. We measure it both demonstrated legislative ambition. So this is women and men who leave the parliament and decide to run for a national office. So everybody who left the parliament in every session, we have coded for what they have done immediately after. And so we know if they have run for a national election. And so this is the demonstrated legislative ambition. And then on the other side is realized legislative ambition. And these are people who have actually been elected to national office after they have left the European Parliament. And this was immediately after they have left, like within 2 years, not 10 years later or anything like that. And the important things to note in this is like these are the survival rates in the European Parliament. So as it's going down, you're more likely to exit for this exact reason. We show that men and women in quota countries, or when quotas are in use in our quota group, this is the green line and the orange line, that they're much more closer together, have much more similar career trajectories than the non-quota men and the non-quota women. And in the realized ambition, it's actually indistinguishable between these quota men and quota women in the speed in which they jump to the national parliament. And so we think this is pretty interesting, and we have lots of things in this chapter that we explore even more in depth and try to explain why that is and why we think it might be going on. Those are kind of the big takeaways from what we won't really be presenting here that will lead us into kind of what we're doing today. So we think we've set up a really nice research project where we look at, and I haven't presented this here, but we look at candidate selection and then what the national party delegations look like in the European Parliament, what people who decide to leave the Parliament do afterwards. And then this is a chapter where we look at while MEPs are in the European Parliament, how do quotas affect sort of the internal advancement within the party groups? And so we are examining how and if quotas affect individual career behavior, and we are asking if quotas indirectly affect the internal leadership distribution within the legislature. So this is really what we're going to present today, and what we're interested in this chapter is how has leadership distribution changed with the introduction of quotas into the European Parliament. And these are quotas that are used in national party delegations. And so within a European party group, you have only a percentage of MEPs that are being elected under quotas, which is a really unique situation for us to explore that really can't be captured if you're looking just at a national legislature itself. So quotas in the European party group. So we know that there's variation in quota use within the groups over time. There are no European party groups that have every single one of their national parties using quotas at any given point, but that it has been growing over time. But the rate of this growth across the groups has been pretty uneven. But what we are able to show is that there's a persistent link between the use of quotas and the increase in women across groups. So by and large, it's very easy to show in our data that when quotas are used, more women are elected. When more women are elected, there are more women in the groups. This is not exactly the most interesting thing of our work that we're choosing to explore, but it's important to note. So here you can see a figure where we're showing the share of women that are elected using quotas. This is the blue line. The share of women, or without quotas, is the blue line. The share of women elected in quota parties within the party group is the red line. And then the green line is the share of parties in the group that are using quotas over time. So if you look, say, at the S&D group, from the first wave to the 9th wave, you went from basically nobody using quotas, very few, to just over 60% of the parties are using quotas. And the growth of women in the group is moving over time too, but that move is steeper from those coming into quota parties. So this is just to give us sort of a look at what's going on in the Parliament. But of course, you know, there's lots of moving parts, so we're not teasing out the causal effects just yet. And these are just descriptive graphs. But what we do kind of take away from this is that, and what we're able to show in some of the other models in the chapter, is that the growth of women in the party groups is very closely associated with the growth of the use of quotas, and the growth of women in parties that do not use quotas is much, much slower. So that these quotas are really having this descriptive effect that has been identified elsewhere. And you can see that here. This is just a simple fixed effects regression where we show the share of parties using quotas over time is associated with an increase in the share of women in the Parliament. Like I said, non-quota parties have a smaller increase. And one of the things that we do with the fixed effect model is we can isolate this effect from the effect of time by throwing in that wave fixed effect. So this isn't just like the natural growth of women in politics over time, that it actually is an effect of a quota, an additional effect of a quota on top of that growth over time. So establishing that quotas are working and that quotas are bringing more women into the Parliament and national parties, and this is changing the distribution of women within the party groups, we want to know what are some of the other indirect effects of quotas within political careers and within the parties. And so we, sort of hypothesize and lay out different ways that we think this is happening. First, like I've shown you, quotas increase the pool of women relative to men. This just means there's more women around in decision making. There's more women when the party groups are deciding who's going to serve in different leadership posts. And then there's more qualified women there for them to choose from. We think this addition of women into decision making also facilitates effect where people are learning about women's impact in the Parliament themselves and learning sort of the pros of working with women and assigning women to leadership positions. We also think that the European Parliament is a unique place to explore maybe how this learning is working, because it is not necessarily immediately clear to everybody which women are coming from quota countries or quota states or quota parties like it would be in a national legislature. So we don't expect there to be the same kind of backlash effects that you might find in a national legislature when quotas are implemented. There might be some, but we don't expect it to be as large. We also know that the way that leadership assignment works in the European Parliament is not at all really in the power of an individual. Oh, I'm not moving enough, so my lights just turned off in here. And we also know that over time there's been a focus on sort of dictating gender neutral assignment in leadership and equalization about men and women across leadership, which has created more opportunities for women. So overall, all of these things contribute to a more equal distribution of men and women in leadership positions over time, and this is what we expect. So we hypothesize that the introduction of quotas into the group should increase gender equality, which we've sort of already shown a little bit here, and that they should also increase the leadership opportunities for women from the group. So how do we explore leadership in the Parliament with respect to gender? So we have career data on MEPs from the whole span thus far of the European Parliament. We have quoted also committee leadership and EP leadership through the second half of this current one. So we picked up the new data in January 2022 when they switched to new positions. And we code them as we know from our data and from what we've used in other chapters, their education, their profession, and then here we're focused on their leadership in the European Parliament. So whether or not they were in committee leadership, so a committee chair or committee vice chair, whether they had a leadership position in the institution as a whole, and whether they had rapporteurships. And from that, we are able to sort of measure a whole bunch of things, but in this paper we're going to look at, I showed you earlier the share of women in the European Party groups as a whole, and now we're going to look at the share of European Party group leadership positions that are held by women. And when we calculate the share, this is, we've calculated how many positions a party group had at any given time, and then how many of those positions were held by women compared to men. And our main independent variable in these models, because we're looking at the party groups, is the percentage of parties in the group that use a party or a national legislative quota. So instead of a binary, because it's not binary in the party groups, we have this percentage measure. One of the things that we have done is group the groups over time. That's a lot of things, groups. They have changed names, they have kind of rearranged a little bit, and we've settled on these 6 sort of groups that we think are continuous over time. So if you're curious how we did that, it's listed here. I won't go through it in too much detail. Most of our graphs will include these major groups. Our models do include the far right parties, but not as like a continuous group over time. There's like a chunk of them sort of in the early waves and then a different chunk of them in the later waves. The only people we don't include in this analysis are those that have not belonged to any group. So measuring leadership. So we measure, like I said, we measure the gender share of chair and vice chairs held by a party group. So if a party group had 10 committee chairs and 5 of them are women, our measure would be 50%. When we think about institutional leadership, we think about the EP presidency, the vice presidents of the EP, and the quaestors. And then we also calculate how many rapporteurs a party group had in a given legislative session. And we calculate how many of those were held by women. So we have the share of women holding the rapporteurships. And we have this for each European party group in each wave, so from 1 through 9. And these are kind of the general trends that we have. So I'm always like, this is on my left. So on my left, probably your right, we have women in committee leadership, and then the other set of graphs are the share of rapporteurships that have been held by women. And we break these down by both the total and then the share of women, quota women, which is red, and the share of non-quota women, which is yellow. And you can tell in most of these situations, the share of quota women is rising over time, and the share of non-quota women is a little less linearly increasing. Of course, in the very early sort of waves, we see that the share of non-quota women is going to be higher because there was very few women that were being elected by quotas. But in most parties, these become more equal over time or even cross. So there is something going on there. We're able to show kind of these descriptive patterns of how women are becoming a larger part of leadership, and that there are differences between those that come in with groups and quotas and those that do not. But we want to sort of parse this out more, and we know that there's effects of wave of time. There are effects of what party group you are in, and that, you know, not every party group has the same number of leadership positions. So being given 50% of 2 positions is much different than being given 50% of 50 positions. Each one of those extra positions counts a little bit more. So we've done this in a fixed effects model. We use a 2-way fixed effects regression to isolate the effects of quotas from just the general increase in women in the group. And again, the observation of this is the percentage of women in each type of leadership position in each party group in each wave. And we include, again, a wave fixed effect to account for general time trends. And what we find is that this very first column, model number 1, these are all of the leadership positions combined in each wave and the percentage that are held by women. And this shows us that as the share of women in the group increase, clearly the share of leadership increases, which kind of makes obvious sense. But also as the share of parties in the group that are using quotas increases, there's an independent effect of the share of women in leadership. And if you look at models 2, 3, and 4, where we look at leadership, committee leadership, and rapporteurships, we find that this effect is mostly driven by rapporteurships assigned to women. So there's an independent effect of the use of quotas with the assignment of rapporteurships to women that is on top of the effect that we see of just the women in the group increasing. And so that's really interesting to us, in what kind of what we had hypothesized shows up in these rapporteurs. As you see, of course, the number of observation changes over time, because not all party groups had leaders and things like this. All right. So preliminary, we conclude from this analysis is that quotas, which I did not spell right there, have an indirect effect on leadership in the European Parliament by increasing the share of women over time, but that they also have a direct effect on the allocation of rapporteurships. And as we showed, as the share of parties that use quotas increases, the share of women with rapporteurships increases on top of the general increase that we see just by the introduction of new women. But of course, they are not the only decision makers in this process. If you know anything about how decisions are made about who gets rapporteurships, committee leaderships, and whatnot, there are multiple sort of levels of decision making going on. It's not just the party group itself saying, I want this woman here, or I would like this man there. We've done some work on this, and I'll get to like some of the work that we've done at the European Parliament itself, sort of talking about how groups think about the leadership allocation process. And of course, it's very complex, but it is somewhat formulaic across the groups. Most of the groups use a version of a double d'Hondt method, where they award leadership posts among the national party delegations. So in the institution as a whole, the party groups that are the largest are allocated the most positions that they can then award to individual MEPs. And then these groups also award these positions within their party groups to national delegations, mostly based on size. So large national parties and the large groups will have the most positions to award to their MEPs. Small parties and small groups will have the least number of positions. And so this means that once all of this allocation of leadership occurs, there's a national party that is making a choice of the individual that goes in the position. So we look then at leadership allocation within the national parties. So we take it a one step lower. Again, we use the 2-way fixed effects regression to isolate the effects of quotas on national party leadership decisions from the increase of women in the parties in general. Here we are able to measure quota use at the national level. We measure it as whether the party uses a quota, whether that quota exists because of national legislation or because the party opted to use it themselves. And so this allows us to include a binary measure of quotas, but we also use a measure in the model to control for the number of other parties in the group that are using quotas. The observation at this level is the percentage of women in each type of leadership position in each national party delegation in each wave. Again, we include wave fixed effects, and we include group fixed effects here to sort of account for differences across group, which incorporate things like ideology and whatnot of the parties. So once we do all that, we again sort of are able to show that there is this indirect effect of the share of women in the party. As the share of women in the party increases, the amount of women that are assigned leadership positions by the national parties increases. And we call this an indirect effect because the quotas are definitely significantly related to an increase in the share of women. We didn't put that model in here because we show it like very early on in the book. So quotas are definitely increasing the share of women in parties, and the increase in the share of women in the parties is associated with an increase in national party delegations awarding leadership in the European Parliament. The quota itself then does not have an independent effect at the national party level. And then the share of parties in the group, again, kind of has this effect for rapporteurships. But overall, the way that we think this process is working through national parties is just by bringing more women into the parties. And then more women are available for these positions as they become available to the national parties. Okay. But there, like I said, there's a lot of moving parts. And so we do move beyond our quantitative analysis in this chapter. Some of the things that we want to take away from the quantitative analysis before we move on is that quotas bring more women into the European Parliament. This has shown us this allows for more women to be in the pool for leadership. This leads to an increase in women in leadership. We find this effect holds at the party group level and at the national party level. And so we conclude that quotas have an indirect effect on women's progression in their careers. The only direct effect that we identify is that of the allocation of rapporteurships among the party groups. So our next step is that we use qualitative research to explore how these party groups are impacted by the presence of quota men and women. And so we spent some time this summer, and then we'll spend some time early this year interviewing leaders of the party groups at the European Parliament and administrative officials within the group to understand kind of how the leadership allocation works in practice and how gender might come into that. And overall, the main takeaways from our interview data is that, like we have shown, leadership allocation is a major balancing act between the needs of the group, the national party, and the European institution as a whole. The changes in the gender distribution of the pool has mostly had positive effects by bringing more women into these roles. And it's also been, changes in gender parity norms over time that have required some of these positions to be distributed equally across genders. But of course, that gender distribution impacts national parties differently because they may have to nominate a woman when the national party itself would have preferred to have nominated a man. But by the time it gets to them, it's time for a woman to have the job. And this is sort of what we have found through our interview data. But overall, it seems amongst the party groups that the quotas are working to ensure that no matter who needs to be nominated to a leadership position, whether it needs to be a man or a woman, that there are several well-qualified women available when this happens, because there are just more women around in the parliament. But there are instances where these women would otherwise not have been considered for the role had it not been for sort of the gender parity norms within this leadership allocation process. And we have some good qualitative evidence where we have people actually saying like, oh, we had picked out all of the men we wanted for these positions, but then we couldn't nominate men. And so we nominated this woman and, surprise, surprise, she's fantastic at her job. So it's all sort of a lot of inner working parts, but overall positive for women and positive for the party groups and the national parties as a whole. So the last thing I'll show you here is we do a little bit of exploration in the chapter then to then look at if there are more women in the parliament and there are more women in leadership, do the sort of gendered patterns in committee service that we see in other legislatures still hold in the European Parliament? So we pull the data first across waves to see where women are more likely to serve as committee chairs and vice chairs. This allows us to examine sort of the pattern in women's work within the legislature to see if it conforms to gendered patterns. If it does conform to gendered patterns, we would expect to see more women in committees like the culture, of course, the FEM committee. I'm trying to think of other ones that we would expect it. Sort of, we would not expect women to be kind of some of the more high profile economic committees, foreign affairs committees, things like that, where men tend to dominate. So we'll show you a figure here where we'll look at that. We also track these positions over time to see kind of how the introduction of quotas may have reshuffled men and women leaders across committees. And so this is what our data looks like here. So if you're looking at figure A, this is just in the entire history of the parliament, the share of women and the share of men that have been leaders on committees in the European Parliament. So overall, men outstrip women, or there's more men as leaders over time, but you can see that there are different patterns on different committees. So say in the Agriculture Committee here, we see that there's been way more men than there have been women. And then of course, on the Fem Committee, there's been way more women than there have been men. So you can kind of see how that balances across time. On economic and monetary affairs, we see what we would expect given what research has told us about gender patterns of committee assignment. There are many, many more men on the economic committee leadership over time than there have been women. Yeah. And I think that the very first one is the Foreign Affairs Committee, the AFET. So that's a similar pattern there. If we look at figure B, this shows how this percentage has changed over time. So across the waves. We don't have a measure here to show sort of when quotas are coming in, but sort of our first quotas appear in wave 4, and then there's more and more over time. So if we think of over time, are these patterns getting better? It's kind of unclear from this figure. We can see in the Foreign Affairs Committee, they kind of get a little bit closer, then they get further apart, then they get closer together again. But we do see on economic and monetary affairs that women and men are starting to be more equal parts of the leadership over time. They flip-flop in the Employment Committee, they flip-flop in cultural affairs. In the environment, it's a little less clear, but we also have some more men coming into the Fem Committee over time. And we did hear a lot in our interviews about parties trying to encourage men to also participate in this committee, especially because they can participate in this committee on top of any other committee assignments that they have. So that's one of the things. So overall, I think our takeaway is that there are still gendered patterns in committee assignment amongst the leadership, but that they are changing over time as more women enter the institution and quotas are more widely used. So overall, our conclusion is that quotas are an important instrument for gender equality within the party groups and the national party delegations, that the party groups have responded to the introduction of more women by incorporating them into leadership roles, which is a positive sign. And this is just one piece sort of in our story of how quotas and careers are related. Again, in this chapter, we show that quota leads to more women in the institution. And the other chapters have shown that this is because there are more women on lists and more women get elected. Quotas are also associated with more qualifications for party delegations in the leadership, and we show that through examining education amongst party delegations in the European Parliament. So it supports our argument that quotas can open up more opportunity for women, both within the institutions and across time, and that career opportunities and paths are altered in ways that extend beyond initial access to an election or an institution. So we do find evidence that quotas do create this shock where more women come into the institution, but that they also have this effect of changing the slope of careers as they become, as these women move through their sort of lifetime career. So that's sort of the overall conclusion. If you're interested in the project, here's sort of the chapter list that you can ponder as we move towards taking questions. We hope that there will be interest in this work, and we welcome any feedback that you all have to offer us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. I've learned a lot. So now I will give the floor to the discussant. Johanna, you have the floor for about 10 minutes.
Thank you, Natalie, and thanks a lot, Andrea and Will, for asking me to give comments on this. So just to say as background, like I have read this chapter 6, but I also took a look at some of the other chapters you sent to me. So it's a really impressive piece of work, and you have done kind of so much already. So it was very inspiring. For me, it was fascinating, obviously, to read this specific chapter. Kind of I'm not the best expert in the world on quotas, but kind of having researched gender equality in these party groups for the past 5 years. So this was really like I could see so many kind of also like it was kind of like a springboard for some of the questions that we have been asking. So there were a lot of connections. So it was really just to say that I think I really look forward for the book coming out and kind of seeing the whole thing. So maybe kind of the overall comment is like just on the whole chapter and on this whole analysis, Andrea, I think you did a great kind of job in presenting it. When reading the chapter, I think my main comment would be to kind of push a bit more on each of the findings because they are really interesting. And I think that you've done this kind of a crazy amount of work to arrive at the findings. So now it would be then the moment to kind of evaluate their significance. Like this whole idea that you kind of, you take all of these leadership positions within the European Parliament, and then you find the direct effect of quotas on the rapporteurships. So kind of one aspect of these policy leaderships. So really to kind of, that would be the first thing to really to push, like, what is it and what does it mean and what's the significance and what about the other positions where the effect is just to have this kind of pool of women, what we kind of see anyway, like even in our EU gender research, we always talk about that all of the political groups currently, because they have even for the ECR and the EPP, which perform the worst, also they have over 30% women. They do have the critical mass. And you kind of look at the effect of quotas there, but we know that there is this pool. So then to evaluate that, what's the kind of the difference between these leadership positions? So this is just an overall comment for the whole chapter. Then maybe kind of coming to what was one of the most interesting things for me. So I start with this kind of your key argument and the key finding that quotas really only matter for this kind of this pool, this size, the number of women within the political groups as candidates for this kind of leadership positions. So this really raises a lot of issues for me. So it kind of shows that the quotas only go this far, and then we need all of these other rules after them to push for women for these positions. And I know that it's not kind of the focus of your research, although your qualitative research goes a bit that way. So I'd kind of like to push you to be a bit more explicit on this point. So, you know, just to say that we could look at the EP rules of procedure, we could look at the party group statutes, which you actually don't do that much, like as a qualitative data source, like what's there on these other rules and on these other measures that might come into play. And this is obviously a place where we have done like some of the EU Gendem, this ERC project that I've had kind of this research to say that what these other rules might be. And I say it also, and how they matter for quotas, like kind of this interaction. And I say it because kind of like thinking about your audience, who is going to read this chapter and who is going to read this book. So I hope that it's going to attract kind of lots of different kinds of people. But then some people who are not so into these debates, I think they're going to struggle like with this idea that where are the quotas? Like what quotas are we talking about? Because sometimes you have this, I've kind of underlined when I was reading the chapter, you kind of talk about quotas within the party groups. And you mean these national parties. But for me, for example, this would mean quotas that the EPP might have for their leadership positions, which might be relevant for women's career progress in the European Parliament. So I'd kind of push you to explain a bit more or nuance a bit more like what we are looking at and what also might matter, like when we look at the political groups. So really there's also these kind of internal measures and rules, gender equality practices within the political groups. So here, when you write about group level quotas, it kind of becomes problematic because this is where my thinking goes. But overall, I think it's kind of really interesting, this finding that there is no automatic link kind of between quotas and all of these other things, except then for these rapporteurships. And it must mean that kind of so much other type of work is then needed also for women to make progress in their careers in the European Parliament. So maybe I'm also kind of asking you to, in some ways, to make this work a bit visible, because we know that quotas anyway take a lot of work as well. And I'm sure that in the other chapters, you talk about kind of implementation and sanctions and lobbying for them. So it's also kind of a similar thing in the Parliament. So this is just kind of the overall comments where I thought that you could do a bit like one of the, maybe the biggest comments. And then I have like one other big comment and then lots of kind of small ones. I don't know if I have time for the small ones, but as you might guess, like as I'm not a quantitative scholar, so I have more comments on your kind of your qualitative data. Like I'm really glad that you also did the interviews, and it seems that you had access and you spoke to kind of good people. I didn't see the interview data exactly. It might be in another chapter, but also just to bring to your attention when I looked at the kind of list of content. So for all of the other chapters, you had this subheading called empirical strategy. And for this chapter, you actually didn't have it, but it might be relevant because my question to you is that like what would be a bit more systematic qualitative analysis of this data? Like you kind of treated it as a source of information, but there are other ways to treat this in interview citations. You know, the groups might be performing. They might have these ways of talking about kind of that we always choose on the basis of merit, which would be the liberal maybe way to talk about it. So kind of looking for this way that you use this data, and then looking for like also a systematic analysis. So the differences between the political groups disappeared in this qualitative analysis section, which was quite interesting. Like really kind of, I don't know how much data you had, so you might not be able to push that far with the differences between the groups, but this would definitely kind of be interesting. So just to say that I'm glad that you had this data, but do a bit more with it, like in terms of the analysis and in terms of kind of explaining it. Then I was also fascinated about the kind of like some of the smaller points now, like about the far right or the radical right populists, cordon sanitaire, which you, for example, mentioned. It's also a rule, just to say to you, that it could be kind of understood as a rule that then interferes or disrupts the impact of the quota. It's been researched, so I was wondering if you could kind of add references like to Natalie's work and to kind of a lot of other people's work, and evaluate kind of the significance of the radical right populist groups. I know that the ID, obviously, it doesn't have this long history and you really had this longitudinal data, but you kind of had references to it, so it might be interesting to develop these points a bit more as well. Then I wondered, in the beginning of the chapter, you really nicely explain all of the leadership positions and why you choose to focus on them, like committee chairs, coordinators, rapporteurs, political group leaders. In this section, you don't really talk about the national delegation leaders, but then it comes later in your chapter. So you're not ignoring it totally. But somehow it doesn't count at the same level as the other leadership positions. So I wanted to ask you about it, like how actually you treat it and how do you see it? Because we know from the EU gender research and kind of other research that actually this might be the hidden gendered structure within the European Parliament, that a lot of the national delegation leaderships are dominated by men, like even in groups like Social Democrats, which then, pretend to be very gender equal. So this is kind of, could it be one of your leadership positions, and why is it treated a bit differently? And then knowing that national delegations have such a different significance for different political groups. Like some groups are more centralized, like the EPP and the S&D and the Renew. A lot more happens at the group level. So the group level leadership positions are important. But then in other groups like the ECR or even the left, it's really the national delegations that matter. am I, Natalie, okay for 2 more small points or?
Perhaps just one, and then we can let William and Andrea reply, and then
perfect. Okay. Good. And other people, I wanted to ask you about the type of quota, but this I'm going to leave for other people, and we can come back to it. So finally, just to say that, like maybe to come back to the first point, to kind of to add a bit more, like I was really missing kind of this analysis or talk about the political groups themselves. And kind of the differences between them. Like I was asking myself that, what did I learn about the Greens, for example, by reading this? So you don't do much of this kind of discussion about the political groups and some of the surprising things in relation to them. So I was wondering, and there are things in your data. So this might be kind of interesting, and just kind of looking at what you showed, the findings to us, like a lot of things. So this might be my final kind of wrap up point. So thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Andrea and Will, I don't know which one of you want to start for a quick reply, and then I will open up the floor and just see who has questions and comments for you.
Do you want to jump in, Will?
Yeah, I'm happy to give you a rest for having having presented for us. Thank you. Thanks first, everyone, especially to Johanna for having prepared such rich comments. Those are really incredibly helpful, and also track very nicely with the feedback we had last week from our book workshop that we just had over here in the US. I think that really, I would say that most of these things are excellent points that we need to just consider to incorporate. The chapter that we presented today is probably the freshest in terms of its writing, which also means it's the least developed, which is why it's really wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to take these points of advice. So in terms of the things just to respond about, which might help to give a better picture for both Johanna and everyone else in terms of the data that we have that hasn't yet been incorporated. So in terms of interview data, yes, one of the things we definitely know we need to focus on more is a more systematic usage of the interviews that we've collected. So we've had about 20 interviews with this project, specifically since last summer with the party groups. We do have complete coverage of all of the EPG, so all of the different party groups that are currently in Parliament, with at least 2 interviews for each, I think, if I'm not mistaken. So that's good in terms of the secretariat level. Then we also have a smattering of MEPs as well and some policy advisors. It's interesting what you said about what groups might do to perform in the interviews. One thing that we don't play up as much in this chapter that we know we need to discuss more is that we did not prompt gender at all in our discussions with the European Party Group interviews. So it was a more sort of pitch to them as an inquiry on leadership strategies within the party groups, and didn't bring out the gender points and allowed those to speak for themselves until actually had a great interview with an EPP official where he went all about gender, and then he is, so what are you actually really writing on? I said, oh, gender, and then he kept on talking for another half an hour. So anyway, there is a lot to actually uncover there and discuss, and thanks Verena for your comments too, as you have to pop out soon. So yes, there's more we need to pop in with the data analysis, more systematic. We also thankfully have about 70 interviews with MEPs themselves from over the course of the past 10 years, from Andrea's and my previous works. And one of the things we're planning to do this summer is to revisit all of those notes and bring in more of because there's an institutional story, which is the party groups, and then there's also in the parties, of course, and then there's a personal story with the MEPs in their own careers. So we want to bring in more of that as well. And although those works were not particularly about gender, there is good balance across men and women MEPs, and of course, gender plays into career progression and all sorts of ways that are not, only coming out whenever you're asking them about gender. The only other thing I was going to just sort of quickly respond to, I really like the idea of the national delegation leaders. I agree with that would be really helpful to look at more systematically. I would love advice, especially from anyone else in the call, about how to access that more systematically, because one of the problems that I see is that you can identify that for the current parliament and also for the past parliament or two, but there's not a sort of central repository for collecting those data because it's sort of managed ad hoc by the national parties. And I did try to, about almost 10 years ago now, do a paper with national delegation leadership as part of that. And I remember writing to secretariats, and a very kind person, I think it was the EPP, sent me like a stack of old phone books from the 80s and like literally the hard copy. And that's, so anyway, if anyone knows how to get that all the way back, we would love that, because then we could do that the same way. Otherwise, we'd have to think about subsetting into just, you know, wave 7, 8, 9 or something like that. So, but yes, I'll take that as further investigation. Anything major that I left out, Andrea, that we should quickly put out on the table before we take more comments? Not sure if Andrea has anything else to add.
Yeah, I don't know if I have much else to add. I think just to thank you for those comments. Those are really great. And we had sort of received some feedback last week about like what is this effect on the rapporteurships and what does this mean? And so we're definitely going to explore that one a little bit more. And some of the stuff about, I think what the chapter needs is a little bit more sort of richness in what's going on in the groups, which is your comments have alluded to, and that's definitely something that's on our agenda. And the different types of quotas. Yeah, that's something that like we even in the other chapters where we talk more about that explicitly, we're now going to dedicate a lot more time to sort of explaining exactly what's going on sometime. Probably won't make it into this chapter, but it will be, you know, in the introduction to the book or something, so readers will be aware of it. But thank you so much. Your comments were excellent.
Okay, so now we have plenty of time for any other questions or comments or remarks. Just raise your hands or put on the camera. Yes, Petra. Perhaps, although everybody, no, more or less everybody, just introduce yourself shortly before speaking.
Hello, everybody. Petra Arons from Tampere University, former team member of Johanna. So speaking also from the Eugenian research, but I also did quite some research on quota regulations and parties in Germany and Austria, and I'm now studying parliaments in Finland, Germany, and Poland. So I'm also looking into these issues in that sense. First of all, congratulations on this project. It sounds really impressive. The amount of data you collected, and also like, you know, the different qualification or categorizations you have with education and so on. So I think this is really amazing to have this kind of data set. I'm also very curious to see the book. When is it coming out again? Sorry.
Whenever we find a publisher that would be happy to have it. So hopefully next summer is the aim.
Okay, so I hope there will be a mail somewhere or some tweets about it so that I can get hold of it. So it sounds extremely interesting. I have some questions along the line with what Johanna said, but also some others. Maybe I pick up on the question Johanna dropped, the one on quotas. When you speak about, you look at quotas. If I understood you correctly, you looked not only at the parties who are object to or subject to legislated quotas, but also voluntary party quotas. So did you then also, so one of my questions would be, how do you measure that? Because I mean, for the different countries, there are different kind of voluntary party quotas that also changed over time. So, and also you said, like, when I remember correctly, you also covered like 1979 to nowadays. And I think there you also have quite some differences in between there with, you know, let's say, for example, I know that some Danish parties had some quotas in the 80s, but they dropped them, or in the 90s, and then again. So I would be interested to hear more of like how you actually applied these changes or looked into that. And then I was also intrigued by these questions about rapporteurship. And I was one other thing before, because I was wondering, you know, or even though you can show that there is this kind of causality, or like that you have like for quotas help to increase the number of women, which I wouldn't question. But I would also always think, and I don't know if you already discussed it in other chapters, that the European Parliament is also quite specific setting, also with different relevance for the different political, national political parties. As you know, like often considered the European elections as second order. So this is also one reason why they send women. because it's just not important. And to be quite direct on that, for Germany, it's also a way, particularly for the conservative parties, to get rid of high-level women. So who would, could attract the male leadership in Germany, or could become a female leader in Germany, and so they just send them to the EU level to be the leader there. So this is also other factors that might impact that, why there are more women. I'm wondering how you account for that. And also about the question of, are there maybe also attitude change towards women in politics, how this play in, which makes probably also difference for the different countries. Because I know for Denmark, it's a different situation than for Germany, France, or let's say Italy, or Hungary or Poland. So these different attitudes to quotas, but also to women in politics may also make a difference in there. And then to return to this rapporteur question, sorry, just 2 more points if possible. I was just wondering more on the data, is this an increase for women in general or only for the women who arrived by quota? And then I was wondering, is their share, the share for the rapporteurship actually the same as the share for women in the political groups, which I would think like that would be fair enough to have, like, the same number of women in rapporteurship, so you would have this effect. But if it's still lower, then okay, why not more women then still? And this brings me to my last point, or back to your title of disrupting careers, even if you say you want to have it positive, but what you also show, it is indeed a disruptor for a specific group of men. And I have to admit that I first have a problem with the term low quality men. I don't know if this is just a shortcut for the presentation, but I would think about men with lower education background, which is like low quality man sounds really like a strange label to me, also high quality man, because, how do you measure quality? Or, so in that sense. And I'm wondering, because I had the feeling what you were now presenting in the data, but maybe this is just due to what you present, it was a lot about what happens to the women, or what are the effects for the women. But I would be also interested to see the data or the results for the men. So who actually drops out? Do they, which kind of men drop out in rapporteurship, in leadership positions, and so on, to see also the effects there. And if you say that there is an effect based on education, I think this would be really excellent to pull this out, and this would be also a really good contribution to the debate on how diverse are parliaments, and what kind of equality are we looking for, and what effects do we have here. So, but I would be interested to hear more about that.
Okay, because there were a lot of questions, perhaps you want to already react now before I ask if anyone else has another question.
Yeah, maybe I'll start, Andrea, with some things about rapporteurships and leaderships as well as quality, and then maybe volley over to you after that about the types of quotas, because I know that you've spent a lot more time with those data. So thanks very much, Petra, for the comments. Those are also all very helpful and in line with the sorts of things that we're definitely thinking about. So in terms of the rapporteurships, one thing that we know we need to do more of, and this came out of the qualitative interviews, is that it's increasingly my view that and this is also from my previous work on European Parliament careers, is that different politicians come to the same institution for different reasons, right? And so some people come to the European Parliament because they can't get elected to national office, or maybe their parliament, their parties are sort of trying to shuttle them off to Europe, as you say. Others want to make maybe a particular policy difference in European Union law that is not able to be made at the national level. Others might want to find themselves in a cushy job and live in Brussels for the rest of their professional lives because they like it. That's also fine too. So I think one thing that we need to unpack more, and that I would think to unpack more, would be the types of motivations between these different types of MEPs in general. And there's also gendered aspects to this too, because I think the story of how one becomes the European Parliament plenary president is a very different story for how one becomes the rapporteur. And so one reason that we pick up on the rapporteurships in general is that because we know in specific terms for the European Parliament, this is a key to real legislative power and influence, and whoever the rapporteur becomes really sets the agenda and what the policy outcome is for the Parliament in the whole. That's pretty well really well trodden. So I think, but the answer to your question, probably sidestepping it somewhat, is to say, yes, we need to think about the rapporteurships, but we also need to think about them in relief in comparison to these other types of leadership models, and probably the type of woman or man that wants to become a rapporteur versus something else tells us a little bit more about them and their own career ambitions than only the substance of that office. On the quality bit in education, so I think we were probably trying to just speak here to the sort of the mediocre man story that's come out in a bunch of different work from Tim Beasley, for instance, Johanna and others. And so probably it's true. It's not fair to just say low quality, but we need to think a little bit about, I think we're just dichotomizing here because the variable really was being above and below undergraduate degree in the case of the models. But it's a good point that we need to be careful how we're signaling that. We do use education specifically though, and I think it's a good reason, is that a lot of the other sort of quality indicators that we tend to think of in politics, things like previous experience or brokerage professions, are themselves also so gendered. And so at least we can make the argument that in European terms, in the European Parliament, women and men are sort of equally likely to end up in higher education, if not women more likely to end up in higher education in terms of their qualifications. So we do need to sort of think through when we want to say quality versus qualifications a bit more seriously, but I think that that's kind of the impetus that we're coming at it from there. I think now I turn over to Andrea to say a little bit about the different types of quotas.
Yeah, so one of the great things about our data is because it is so longitudinal that when we have information about a quota, we quote it for the year, whatever. So it's in waves. So, the first year of the European Parliament. So whatever was in effect in that year is the way we treat the quota. So we are able to account for changes in the quota over time. We don't, in this chapter, we don't do a lot with sort of the effectiveness measures of the quotas or the requirements of the quota, but we do some of that early on in the book to show sort of like, if the quota requires 30% women on the list, does it have a different effect than if it requires 50? We find what we find is usually it's the sanctions that make it the most more powerful or not really not a lot of variance in the kind of quota. But that's one of the things that kind of motivated us in this, is that because we have it over time, we can trace these changes as they come and go. We know, for the national legislation, we're fairly confident that we have it right. For the parties, we don't know exactly if it's perfect. And so we do sort of mention early on that that one is maybe less specific as it goes. And so it's no surprise to us that we actually find way stronger effects for national level quotas than for party level ones. So we're making sure we don't put too much kind of emphasis on the party. But yes, great comments.
While we're looking into that, maybe I'll just also say, that's okay. Sophie, if you want to write your question, I'll just also respond real quickly to the second order election thing that Pedro had brought up earlier too. So as someone who studies the European Parliament and tries to make the argument that it's important and we should all study it and that sort of thing, I mean, one beauty to studying the European Parliament in this instance is that we don't actually have to rely much on the voter. So the way that sort of our empirical strategy, to use those phrasing again, doesn't really require us to think a whole lot about whether or not the voters are aware of some of these mechanisms. So it's a bit more about the party, really. So the party is in the driver's seat, the individuals in the driver's seat in our story. And maybe in that sense, it actually even helps us to isolate some of the effects of the quotas and also the other rules that Johanna brought up earlier about internal procedure, which also maybe also helps to avoid some of the empirical muddiness that might come up with having to think about backlash effects as well, because we don't necessarily expect that voters of the ID are going to sanction their parties if they find out that a woman has been put into a effective spot within the internal leadership of the parliament. But so that's one thing that is also on our mind too. But it's always frustrating for me because I'm like, yes, the European Parliament is super important and super fun. So okay.
Okay, I had several questions, so in the meantime, I will ask them, and then we'll see if Sophie wants to try again or write in the chat. So Andrea and Will, I thought it was really, really interesting. Contrarily to Johanna and Petra, I'm not an expert in gender issues. So some of my question might be, really basic or something. But when I was, perhaps it's also because it's one chapter of a larger project. But for me, I was not sure that you make your point really clearly on the causality of it. Because I had like the feeling, you have quotas who allow more women in the European Parliament, so you have a pool for leadership. But then what? And do you have have you tested other variables to show that it's leading to something? And what really matters? Is it just the quotas, or is there any other thing that matters? Nationality, the left-right cleavage? I don't know. I am just like, I was wondering. Yeah, about the small, large groups, because we see at the very beginning, like left-wing groups are usually much more favorable to women and have more quotas and everything than right-wing group and nationalities as well. And whether also you place all the leadership position on the same level, or do you distinguish between them? And that's a bit like the rapporteur, but also between, for instance, women might want to be more policy oriented than institutionally oriented, and have like less. If you're vice president of the European Parliament, it's another type of leadership than chair of a committee in terms of what kind of leadership you have in the European Parliament. And I was also wondering in the book whether you explain a little bit more your expectation on this substantive representation, because you had at the beginning on descriptive representation, but you also work on committee work and everything. So there. And then how do you take into account that to have a position at the committee level, for instance, you have to be a member of that committee. And it's not only up to you as an individual to choose your committee. I mean, they receive like a wish list, and then there are a lot of factors like education, but also previous experiences or gender. But gender is one of the factor, I guess, in that aspect. And yeah, I was wondering whether in the future you will also like to interview perhaps more also women to have their perception of that gender issue in the European Parliament, or whether it's not on your agenda at the moment. But I will perhaps, because we still have 10 minutes, ask if Sophie wants to come in, whether it works or not. Hopefully yes. No. Jeremy, do you want to try if it works?
Thank you very much for the presentation. This is a super impressive data set and results, and I wanted to follow up on Natalie's comment about the causal mechanism behind it, because I was also pretty surprised by the very high model fit with just a few variables, and we would expect that some other mechanism, and the classic mechanism in allocation of top position would have played a bigger role. So I was surprised by that, and could you maybe elaborate a bit more on this? And then I have another comment regarding the division, the specification you made about the allocation to specific committees, and we can see indeed that there is a big division of labor that represent a gender pattern in terms of, let's say, agentic and communal policy fields. But I think that there is also another interesting and probably pertinent distinction here is between the powerful committees and, let's say, the less powerful committees, which is also the kind of prestigious the sort of, yes, prestigious committees. And looking at your results about I think it was the employment committee, I was very impressed, because actually this is one of the committees that was considered to be less influential until the early 90s, then changed to become a powerful committee, and we see clearly an increase of share of men, and then it decreased again after, I think it was 2009, and it actually perfectly followed this pattern with the changes over time of the strengths of committees. So maybe this is a suggestion for you to dig up also this distinction.
But she asked the question in the chat, so either,
okay, perfect.
Will or Andrea, you want to read it, or I can read it out loud. But she has managed to put her question in the chat. So.
Yeah, so I can just read it quickly for everyone. So she's asking here if gender quotas, what do gender quotas say about the countries themselves? Do you discuss this in the book? So wondering about different country differences. For example, in 2019 elections, Finland and Sweden had no quotas, but Poland did at the national legislative level. Finland and Sweden do have more women than Poland. So basically, do we know if women have the same good career chances from Sweden or Finland than the ones that come from Poland? So that's a very provocative question, and we use Poland quite a lot in the data as a country that has legislative quotas, but also very low success rates of placing women into positions. That has, in our view, a lot to do with the ballot structure that allows parties to tend to put the women that are required on their list at the bottom of the list. So unlike in other cases where you might have a zippering or something more gender equal in terms of list placement, Polish parties do find ways to circumvent the legislative quota quite strongly. Whereas, of course, Nordic countries tend to have a more party-driven selection of. So that's Jeremy. I think your mic's still on, by the way. Just to let you know.
I'm Sophie. I don't know.
Oh, there's Sophie. Okay.
Yes. I quickly came to Jeremy's office. I have also a second question regarding the rapporteurships that you measured, because they are very different kind of rapporteurs. They are the ones who participate in the ordinary legislative procedure or the co-decision procedure. And I would define them as very powerful because these are the legislative procedures where the European Parliament has veto power, while other rapporteurs in other kind of legislation, they're only there for conciliation or for advice. So did you also make a difference in that position in your book?
Yeah, so we don't have systematic data on sort of ordinary legislative procedure versus not to the rapporteurship level, because the way that we code rapporteurships is a count over wave in total. But what I think we do want to do more of is to start specifying differences between committees that are more likely to have larger shares of. So an easier way of doing this for us in terms of just the breadth of the data would be to, for instance, say what percentage of the employment committee within this wave, that wave, the next wave were ordinary legislative procedure or co-decision files taken up, so we could sort of control for it in that way. I think that's another thing we need to do alongside prestige. I take a lot from Rick Whitaker's article about choosing committees, about prestige. There's some other work out there that tries to sort of rank order what's the most and less prestigious committees within the European Parliament, and that's something that we need to overlay on our story as well about committee choice and therefore also leadership choice. And thanks, Jeremy, for pointing out the interesting anecdote of the Employment Committee. I hadn't caught that, but that's a really interesting example that I think I need to dig into more. So really cool idea. There was an earlier point about substantive representation from Natalie. One thing that we think hopefully our book will end up doing is speaking really well to another great gender quotas book that just came out this year by Anna Weeks about essentially how quotas bring in more women who then demand more levels of substantive representation. So whereas her story sort of takes quotas as a starting point for substantive representation, we sort of tried to turn on its head the, well, not turn on its head, but we tried to take the descriptive representation as the starting point and say quotas do everything else too, and try to look at that from careers. So we're trying to find ways to speak to that literature as well, although we don't focus on the substance of the policymaking itself. Andrea, things that I've left off.
I mean, I think to Sophie's questions about differences across countries, one of the things that we kind of took away from our workshop last week was exploring some of this variation in more detail, even if we do it sort of just descriptively. And I think that's where some of this will come in, just talking about how we don't necessarily expect, or how some places we would expect quotas to have an effect because they're needed, and others quotas are maybe not needed as much, and so they might experience some of these things without the quotas. And so we do plan, maybe not exactly in this chapter, but in some of the earlier chapters, to use the variation across all of the different countries in Europe to kind of categorize like where we would expect quotas to appear. I mean, we're not going to tell a story about sort of quota implementation in general, but sort of looking at like left parties in Sweden, we would not expect there to be a quota, but we would expect there to still be lots of access for women in ways to distinguish between parties and countries where we have different expectations. So it's definitely something that we're thinking of. We had initially had some sort of like country case studies we were going to do, but we have a lot going on already. So I think we've moved kind of away from that. As far as the data goes with sort of this share of women explaining leadership so much without having a lot of the other things that we think matter for leadership, I think that is in part an artifact of the way we're modeling this and including the wave in the group fixed effects. I know it's really unsatisfying to be like the fixed effects are picking up all of that, but because we have them in there, like all of these things that we would think of that might also influence the number of women in leadership are being captured in that. So they're not giving us any sort of substantive idea of what else is going on, but we know that, all of the parties in the S&D are similar in some ways. And a lot of things were going on over time that we're capturing in our time effect. And so I think that's why we get the result there. And in various different parts of the book, we do break those down a little bit more and explore what some of those other effects might be instead of just kind of wrapping them into this nice fixed effects. But I think in this chapter, as it moves forward, we're going to focus more on exploring some of these dynamics through our qualitative data and using these quantitative models. It's just kind of like laying out sort of what the situation is and how these things are associated and explaining maybe the causal story a little bit more using qualitative data.
This is the end of our seminar. I would like to thank Will and Andrea for this very interesting presentation. I think it's going to be a great book with a great data set and great results. So I'm looking forward to seeing it in print. And thank you very much, Johanna, for agreeing to discuss the seminar today. And thank you all of you for attending and for your great questions. And a communication. So the next seminar will be on the 18th of May. And you're all welcome to attend. And I wish you a very good afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. Goodbye, everybody.